First, I'm going to be talk a little bit more about this. I'd like to thank CNPS, California Native Plant Society, for inviting me to speak. And with that, as you can see, I did bring in a lot of native plants, and you're welcome to come up and take a look at any of these. I would also like to kind of waft this in our general direction. This is black sage. Black sage. And then we have another one that you may have heard about in your life, Yerba Buena, the good herb. Yerba Buena. And this is a member of the mint family. It is a trailing. It even has a tiny, tiny flower. Okay. And then I think the last one will be the bay laurel, which the native people call this the medicine tree. And it was the inspiration for Anthony's drawing. I do volunteer one morning a week at Chautauqua Adams County Park. I do the nature walk there. We talk about the tule, we talk about the kitchen rock and the way that they process their acorns, the creek, et cetera, et cetera. And I also have the children very gently shake hands with the bay laurel. And we're going to talk about the bay laurel. It's not, the leaves are not as strong as, yeah, usually just giving them a little gentle crush. Or if I grab them and wave the branches at the kids, they, you can start to smell it. It's the bay laurel. It's not the same as the one that we use to cook. The one used in cooking comes from India, and it is hybridized, cultivated specifically for cooking. Yeah. Yes?
You know, there are people who are selling California Bay for cooking. And
someone told me that. I think the other thing is I have the books here, but they're also in the handout, the resources in the handout. I do want to mention these Native American artifacts. I was here. I was present when this one was found in about 1951. And this one, someone's grandmother passed away in the gold country, and they were cleaning out her backyard, their property, and a whole bunch of utilitarian mortar stones and pestles came up. This one is not from the gold country. This one is from the eastern Sierras. This is a type of basalt. And I went through all the pestles and all the bowls, and I matched everything up for the proprietor. And he gave me a very good price. It was the first time that I had made a purchase, but I decided I wanted to do that. And this one is Shumash. When they were filling Lake Cachuma above Santa Barbara up in the San Ynez Valley, they let the people come in and pot up. And I was so small, I stayed with my mother. I never left her side, so I had to be 3 or under. And we went up there. We didn't take any shovels or anything, and we weren't going for that purpose. And I remember standing by our old car, old jalopy, and seeing all these men with shovels digging holes everywhere. And of course, all that's now under Cachuma Lake. But my brother, who was 2 years older than me, he went off up into the Oaks, an area now that's a campground, and he brought back this. And it was perfect and intact. And but this is what I tell the children, these portable mortar stones, when the Ohlone people would go to different places in their territories to collect the acorns or by a seasonal stream, they hauled those portable mortar stones and they just left them there because no one was going to take them. And that's why we still find them. In the foothills, I have found a large one myself. I did the right thing. I recorded it, and it was collected and disappeared. So if I ever find another one, believe me, I'm keeping my mouth shut. In fact, I had a friend at the time who said, Cait, that would have been in the trunk of my car before you could have said acorn grinding stone. But integrity is who you are when nobody knows it. Okay. managed grasslands throughout Santa Clara Valley. Fire removed dead plants, dead grasses, but it also stimulated new growth, which attracted wildlife. It was something that they did every year. And the Spanish, when they first came, they also adopted it. And the ranchers were using it in our foothills and in Morgan Hill area until, I think, the late 1880s. And that's part of the reason why we have the patterns that we do on our hills. Each spring, areas of the valley became very large vernal pools. And these pools attracted wildlife, waterfowl and wildlife, and these seasonal wetlands would last sometimes through April and into May. And this one is at the corner. In fact, this whole area on the old Spanish maps is Laguna Seca, because most of the year it was wet.
Is that Laguna Seca that's now the raceway?
No, there's Laguna Seca North, Laguna Seca. Laguna Seca in Spanish means dry lake.
Oh.
But it may have become a dry lake, but it was once a very, very large vernal pool. But the Spanish did not differentiate.
It's up in the Coyote Valley
Oh.
by Biggie.
Seasonal creeks in every major canyon drain the surrounding watershed. Oops, I'll see on my head. Various streams flowed through the valley, teeming with a variety of aquatic life. The abundance of wildlife attracted to riparian corridors made them excellent places to establish villages. Seasonal creeks in every major canyon drain the surrounding watershed. When one creek dried up, the Ohlone moved to a still flowing creek and set up a temporary camp. Oak grasslands create a rich habitat for a variety of wildlife hunted by the Ohlone. Temporary camps were set up in the foothills during acorn gathering season. Foothills above the valley include oak grassland, mixed hardwood forest, chaparral plant communities, and redwood forest. Each ecosystem provided an abundance of natural resources for the Ohlone. I'm going to get a lot of exercise. Today, few, if any, places remain as they were in the time of the Ohlone. And we no longer hunt and gather in the manner of the Ohlone. Today we do our hunter-gatherer activities in supermarkets and shopping malls. But imagine waking up one morning and discovering you had to collect all your food, all your medicine, and all your building material from this single field. Where would you start? You'd look for a source of water and a suitable place to build a shelter. The tree there is the highest point in your field, so that becomes a natural meeting place, the village site. You can see a little line of shrubs, which is actually a seep, so there's water there. And so there's your water, and there's a place for you to set up camp. Everyone in the field knows where to gather because that tree is the highest point. You explore every inch of the field, making careful observations of every tree, shrub, and plant. You'd look for signs of wildlife, tracks, scat, feathers, fur, nibbled plants, animal, and bird sightings. In time, you develop ways to increase the amount of edible and medicinal plants and those that attract wildlife to the field you now call home. This is exactly what Native people did when they first migrated into the Bay Area. The scholars say that they entered California about 11,000 years ago. They came down the Great Basin corridor and just very slowly filtered out. They were in the Central Valley, Los Banos area about 6,000 years ago. They were at Chautauqua in our valley about 3,000 years ago. So, over time. Okay. Tule wetlands like these in Cowley Hills Regional Park offer a glimpse of what the shores of San Francisco Bay once looked like. Dense stands of tule thrived in these wetlands. Tule was the Ohloni's #1 construction material. It was used to build huts, boats, baskets, mats for sitting and sleeping, cordage, fishing, and fowling nets. Tule grows between 6 and 9 feet tall. It is tough, fibrous, waterproof, acts as a natural insulator, and regrows quickly when cut. And it is also now an endangered species. And you have to have a permit from Fish and Game if you want to collect it. I have actually seen the forms, and they want to know everything. So that's what's happened to our tule. If you have tule on your property, of course, you could probably make free with it, but it cannot be collected. Okay. In addition to Bay Area wetlands, tule is found along streams, in seeps, and drainage ditches throughout Santa Clara Valley. This stand beside the Martin Murphy Trail at Harvey Bear County Park was 9 feet tall when it was photographed. Cattails were another wetland resource used by the Ohlone. Its tender rootstocks and dense seed pod were gathered for food. Cattail fluff was used as divers, padding material, and as good tinder to start fires. Cattail leaves were shredded and used in basketry. Saltgrass. How many of you have ever discovered salt grass? You probably did at Euless Tack just like I did. It's not Bermuda grass. It's not, what's the other nasty grass? Crabgrass. It's actually a native plant species, and it's a ground-hugging plant. It sheds its excess salt through its leaves. So if you pick one up and put it on your tongue, you just get this overwhelming salty taste. It's pretty amazing. Native people harvested saltgrass for use in food preparation. Today, saltgrass is most often found in salt marshes and alkaline waste areas. Now, I call this deer grass, but I have had people say, oh, that's native bunch grass. But to me, in the valley here, I've always called it deer grass. And the seeds were gathered as food, the stalks used in basketry. Large, mature concentrations of deer grass attract a wide variety of wildlife, including deer. It'll create quite a duff, and you'll have all these little trails through it where the rabbits and the smaller animals, including birds, will be active. But I have also read that in some of the big areas in the valley where they have the natural bush grass, deer actually get in and conceal themselves. The Ohlone carefully groomed this resource to produce long, straight stalks for basketry and limited burning to every 3 to 5 years. Common or spreading rush. You have probably seen this plant 100 times and not even given it a second thought. The stems are very, very round and very dense, and the native people use them to make small, watertight baskets. This is a picture of Yerba Buena in autumn. And as you can see, it's still holding on and still smells quite nice. Yerba Buena, a member of the mint family, brewed as tea to soothe sore throats. Yerba Buena tea was also used to calm upset stomachs, ease the tightness of a chest cold, purify the blood, and induce sleepiness. Miner's lettuce, high in vitamin C, harvested fresh and eaten like a salad green. Although we think of it as a winter, early spring plant, it can be found near creeks and seeps year-round. We take vitamin C and vitamin A for granted in our society. However, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, a human can only go 2 weeks without vitamin C before you'll get scurvy. And scurvy is a life-threatening disease. Jack London got scurvy. By the time he got to the Klondike, the Yukon, he had scurvy, and he nearly died. And so things like miner's lettuce, and we're going to come across plants throughout the presentation, depending on the time of year that they were gathered, and the same with the settlers. You had to have that vitamin C, and they were getting it from a lot of different sources. This is a very interesting plant. This is the soapweed. It is common, very, very common throughout the foothills. When it first comes out in the spring, it has this beautiful, beautiful wavy pattern that's flat on the ground, and eventually a bloom stalk will rise out of it. One of the most versatile plants harvested by the Ohlone. Leaves were steamed, eaten like spinach. The sheath covering the root was fashioned into whisk brooms. The bulb used as soap to create a lather, and crushed, thrown into streams to stupefy fish. Bulbs could also be boiled to remove the soapiness, then mashed and eaten like a potato. I don't recommend any of, except for the minor lettuce and a few other ones, I don't recommend anyone go out and start trying to eat a lot of this stuff, because we're at least 2 to 3 generations off the farms, off the ranches. We've been eating processed foods. Very likely our parents ate processed foods. Our systems, we're just not physically capable of going back and eating so much raw material. Okay, mugwort. A plant sacred to the Ohlone. Its leaves were chewed to relieve toothaches and gum pain, or dried, smoked to promote a healthy sleep, inspire sacred dreams, and to ward off evil spirits. And it smells good too. Stinging nettle. I photographed this one yesterday, stinging nettle. I had to put it in there because it's such a common plant and it's such a beneficial plant. Used as a treatment for arthritic pain. Parts of the body affected were lightly or moderately struck with a bundle of leafy stems, irritating the skin, increasing the flow of blood and oxygen to the affected area. This remedy is still used today. That's the whole idea with the icy hots and all the other topicals that you put on yourself on affected areas. It's to stimulate the blood and get the oxygen, and it carries off whatever's going on. The other thing that they use today, people use the stinging nettles for, is late in summer, the nettles will lose their stinging capability. And it was at that time that the women would go out and dig the plants up, get the plants out of the ground, and they would use the roots in their basketry. So stinging nettle. Black sage. This was something new to me. The oil from crushed leaves is antibacterial. Oil was applied to cuts and scrapes to speed healing. Coyote mint. A distillation of this plant in small doses has a calming effect, and in larger doses was used as a laxative. And I think if you eat a big enough amount of anything, it'll be a laxative. But there are trails in our park system that you will smell this plant before you even see it. It will scent an entire area. It's really something to see, and it's a summer bloomer, so it's not an early spring plant. This is chia, tiny seeds, and these seeds are, what is that tiny, tiny black seed on bagels tiny.
Just big.
Poppy seeds.
Poppy seed, tiny, tiny, tiny. This seed, smaller than that. Tiny seeds were harvested for use as a quick source of energy. Hunters carried small quantities of dried chia seeds to sustain them during long hours of hunting. When eaten, chia seeds swell and exude a gelatinous substance which promotes a sense of fullness. When I was leading a hike and I was talking about that, and I took one of the dry seed pods and I tapped it out in my hand, and I was showing the people the seeds, and one little gal immediately grabbed a couple of the seeds and put them in her mouth. And up until that time, I never tasted the seed. And so then I thought, well, okay, we might as well not waste them. And so I took some, and the others did too. And it's interesting how it works. I recommend it. I recommend it because you put a few in your mouth and nothing happens right away. And then you will start to get this rush. Not a rush like 5-hour energy, a bottle of that, but you will get a nice rush and a sense of well-being. So, yeah, and they're so tiny. The seeds are so tiny. The wood rose, we have two native roses in our foothills. The ones with straight prickles and the ones with curved prickles. And I don't know which is which. Wood rose, tea from steep roots shoots, used as a cold remedy. The hips were cooked and eaten to relieve muscular aches. Old hardened stalks were used for arrow shafts. A yellow dye was made from the bark. That's just from a single plant. Sticky monkey flower. A mat of leaves served as a bandage and could be applied over a poultice of medicinal plant material to keep it in place. We cannot possibly know what it was like when the Ohlone were living here. The amount of plants, the amount of animals, the amount of birds. But to me, sticky monkey flower must have been really, really big, robust plants to be able to make a bandage out of this. Sticky monkey flower. Very, very red, chaparral. Very, very resinous plant. This is the seed spring monkey flower. Fresh young stems and leaves used as salad greens. Raw leaves and stems were crushed, applied to rope burns, and wounds as a poultice. This one was quite surprising for me because we see trillium early in the spring and we don't really think that much about it. Tea made from the roots and rhizome given to new mothers to stop bleeding after childbirth. Poultices of the crushed leaves used to cure skin irritations and insect bites. Call this native plant discovery. Blue-eyed grass. The Ohlone used an infusion of the roots and leaves as a cure for indigestion and stomach pain. And similar uses are recorded from other Native American tribes as well. Such a pretty plant. Paintbrush. An infusion of its leaves was used to wash infected sores. Now this is one that I would try. If I was out and I needed something to wash some infected sores, I would feel very comfortable using the paintbrush. It just has that look and feel to it. Grindelia, or gum plant. Tea made from boiled root used for liver ailments. A decoction of leaves was applied to runny sores. Flowering tops collected in spring were eaten as a blood purifier and to relieve throat and lung trouble. Small quantities of decoction held in mouth, but not swallowed, relieved toothaches. This is quite a bug type. This is wild hyacinth. but everybody calls it blue dick. And I keep telling the other docents, let it start with me. Let's start calling it wild hyacinth and see if it catches on. The root bulb collected as food and can be eaten raw, but is sweeter when slow baked in a pit oven. This was one of the many plants native people dug from the earth, hence the term Digger Indians. Columbine. The leaves were boiled and eaten as a spring green, roots boiled, made into tea used to regulate the bowels, ripe seeds were mashed, moistened, then vigorously rubbed into the scalp to discourage lice. Fresh roots were mashed, rubbed into aching joints. And we just thought it was a pretty plant. This is a rare plant. This is Loma Prieta boeta, and it is rare and endangered. It only grows in serpentine soil, and it needs to be where there's a seep or where there's a creek. People get real excited when they find this plant on a piece of property. The strong fibrous roots were gathered and woven into ropes. This is a real common plant later in the year, summer and into fall, right into October. And this is the hillside tarweed. And you can see in the pictures that it actually does have a tiny black seed. Tiny seeds were collected and ground into flour and then mixed with other types of flour used in baking. The Ohlone kept all their seeds separate. They kept all their acorn types separate. They left them in the shells, the acorns, until they were actually ready to use them. And I tell the children at Talk, just like when you get candy at Halloween, it always comes in a wrapper. Keeps it fresh, keeps it clean, until it's ready to be eaten or used. Never knew that. Small native sunflowers, like the ones that we saw on Santa Teresa, thriving here. And this particular sunflower is the Serpentine Sunflower. It is another species that only grows where in serpentine soil. The seeds were eaten dried, roasted, or pounded to extract oils to use in cooking. Who would have thought? But you can imagine expressing the seeds, getting an oil, using your hands with a piece of meat before you're going to put it on the spit, and covering it with a nice oil. Mule ears, seeds gathered, taproot cooked for food, crushed roots and leaves used as a poultice to relieve pain from sprains, reduce swelling. And throughout the presentation, you're going to see a lot of this stuff repeated, but it would depend on when the plants were available to use. You might sprain your ankle in the fall, and that plant is long gone, so you would need something else in the fall. Vinegar weed. How many of you have ever touched this plant or smelled it? It is incredible. It is another very resinous plant. And do you remember when they were selling sea salt and vinegar potato chips and how good they tasted? This smells just like those potato chips taste. And once people on the hikes touch this, it'll stay with them. But it is really, really an interesting plant. Beautiful little flower. Vinegar weed, a diffusion used as a cold and fever remedy and a pain reliever. Fresh leaves used as a flea repellent, which is quite understandable. California fuchsia. Native people drank a decoction of leaves for kidney and bladder trouble. Leaves were also made into a poultice to treat runny sores. This year was the first time that I had ever seen bitterroot, that I was ever aware of it. This was just in April. Someone had the bitterroot, seeing the bitterroot plant on their life list. And something clicked in my head, and I realized that during a practice hike, I had seen some at Rancho San Vicente, which is We the People's latest acquisition, a county park over there by Calero. And so I took him and a bunch of other people to see the Bitterroot, and now I'll read you about it. When fresh, the bitter outer coating slips off easily when put in boiling water. The root is quite starchy, but very nutritious, making it an important food source. The roots were often boiled with other wild foods in a soup. Pounded dried root was chewed to relieve sore throat. It likes rocky soil. It was growing in serpentine, actually on the serpentine rock. Ponitis, a tea made from the white portions of the bark used to treat fevers. Leaves and bark used as shampoo. Snares and carrying nets were made from the plant's fibers. I've seen and photographed this plant, but I have never dug down through the poison oak and other plants to see if it had white portions of the bark. It grows in a mass with poison oak and sage and all kinds of other stuff. Yerba Santa, the holy herb. Filoni relied heavily on this plant, which was used in the treatment of pulmonary conditions and to stop bleeding of minor cuts and scrapes. A strong aromatic tea made from its leaves was used to treat respiratory sicknesses, colds, and stomach aches. A concentrated extract applied hot to a poison oak rash hastens healing. A poultice of leaves was applied to sore muscles, flesh wounds, over bone fractures, and where rheumatism strikes. It was also used as a smoke plant, which was said to help those with asthma. In addition to smoking, the leaves were used as chewing gum. This is an amazing plant, and I understand that it's growing wild right along the road. I wanted to get some, but didn't have time. Right along the road at Cochrane, where it goes into Anderson, the boat launch and stuff. So when you have that sharp hairpin turn, keep your eye out for Yerba Santa. Very resinous, but if it's growing near the road or next to the road, you can grab some. Because I think the highway department owns 5 foot on each side of a road, and so you're not taking it from a park. It's a very, very special plant. And it blooms in the spring. Bursts into flower with each stem producing multiple trumpet-like flowers. The Ohlone relished sucking the sweet nectar from these flowers. Wild cucumber. Root produces a lather that was used for washing the skin, cooking utensils, and basketry. Wild cucumber. When green, seeds were rubbed on skin sores to induce healing. When dry, they were roasted, eaten as a remedy for kidney trouble. Crushed pieces of green roots were thrown into streams to stupefy fish. Ceanothus, also called buckbrush. The original name was buckbrush. The seeds were gathered and eaten. The flower blossoms mixed with water produce a lather for washing. Leaves suitable as tobacco. Root and bark used as an astringent and a tonic. Roots yield a red dye for basketry. There are lots of different types of ceanothus and different colors and fragrances and the types. Some grow flat, some grow into very large bushes. Narrow-leaf milkweed. This is another very important plant too of the native Ohlone. Centers of mature stalks were removed and made into string and fishnets. Milk collected, rolled until firm to form chewing gum. Juice used as healing application for wounds. The Ohlone carefully managed this plant resource to improve its size and quality. And there's an awful lot of it growing along Burnell Road as you start up to the park. So you can park right at the houses right there and walk, and it's growing right in the street at the edge of the curb. And you can collect as much as you want. It's a pretty flower. Buckwheat. Tiny seeds were gathered, pounded into flour for toasted cakes and baked breads. Early pioneers also harvested buckwheat seeds for the same purpose. They gave it the name buckwheat. Buckwheat pancakes. There's a lot of buckwheat foothills. Butterflies love it. Hound's tongue. The roots were cooked, eaten to relieve colic. A poultice was made of the roots as a treatment for scalds and burns. Both common and golden yarrow contain compounds that are anti-inflammatory and hemostatic. Leaves were sucked gently to allow the body to slowly absorb the plant's healing compounds. Crushed, steeped leaves were used to treat arthritis. Leaves were chewed to treat toothaches, headaches, digestive problems, and colds. I would probably try this with the white, the common yarrow. I don't know, there's just something about that leaf that I like. But the golden yarrow also has the same compounds. And so everything would apply to that as well. And they bloom a little bit. Boom. The golden yarrow comes out after the common yarrow. Jeweled onion. Root bulb gathered as food, also used as a flea repellent. So they would collect the blossoms here, the pretty pom-pom flower heads, and they would scatter those around their little tule huts, or they would put them in among their basketry. The wild iris. Leaves used in basketry and to make cordage. Owl's clover. See that leaf? That leaf is very similar to the leaf of the common yarrow. And there's just something about it that looks wholesome. A tea made from its leaves served as a cough remedy. Elegant Clarkia. The seeds were collected, dried, parched, pulverized, and eaten dry, or mixed with acorn flour. Probably has a slightly different taste. Skunk weed. This is late summer, a July wildflower. Seeds gathered in late summer, dried and stored for later use. Seeds were first parched, then pulverized prior to eating plain. Turkey mullein, or doveweed. How many of you are familiar with this plant? Yeah, it's really common. In fact, it wasn't until I started doing the presentation last year that I discovered it was native and that it actually had some benefits. Crushed leaves were thrown into streams to stupefy fish. A poultice relieved internal pains, and a decoction of leaves in warm water relieved asthma and fever symptoms. Seeds attract birds, including mourning doves, hence the name. When I was first passing this picture around, none of the people I knew could recognize this plant. And it's coyote brush. And the reason that you have a very close-up photo of it in bloom here is to see that all of the little flowers do indeed look like a brush. And in European terms, especially Britain, the brush is the tail. When you go fox hunting and you're awarded the brush, that's the tail of the fox. And so the coyote brush, the tail of the coyote, and you see the cartoon Wile E. Coyote, his tail does look pretty scruffy, but that's what the pioneers called it, coyote brush. And it actually has purpose. Leaves heated, softened in hot water, then applied to reduce swelling. Wood from mature plants used in construction and was suitable for arrow shafts. Who knew? Bracken Fern, rootstocks boiled and eaten, also used as a diuretic and worm medicine. Poison oak. Distillations of its root stems and leaves created dyes used in basketry.
If you're not allergic.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how they did it, but I'm told that they had ways of slowly getting immune to poison oak. And I'm sure there was some genetic thing behind it. And so you had these extended family groups that became villages where everybody was kind of related to each other. It's very likely they were all sharing a certain, genetic tendency, either for or sensitive or not sensitive. Because in my family, we don't catch it. Don't know why. Wild blackberry. Berries eaten fresh, boiled to make jam, jelly, or a condensed, chewy fruit jerky. I would love to taste some of this fruit jerky. I don't know if I would have the nerve, but they made they mixed it with meat, little bits of meat, pound, until they had a fruity leather and let it dry, and then they'd eat it. Yeah. Wild grapes, eaten fresh or dried for later use. When dried, raisins were pounded with bits of dried meat to make a chewy, more flavorful jerky. They did this with a lot of these plants. A lot of the fruity plants. Wild strawberry. Eaten fresh or dried for later use. Boiled to make jams and preserves. Leaves used for brewing tea. Tea made from steeped roots soothed stomach disorders. Roots were chewed to clean teeth and ease gum inflammation. It's a really, really tiny strawberry, and our strawberries that we purchase in the stores have been cultivated and hybridized and crossed until they're big and they're red and they're flavorful. The Ohlone didn't have that sense of sweetness and sugar that we're all really accustomed to. So the sugar in the fruit would have been just fine. Now, this one is quite a surprise. This is the Spiny Red Berry, and after a while I started to doubt myself. Is there really a spiny red berry, or is it really mountain mahogany, which is what the piece that I brought in? No, there is really spiny red berry, and it looks just like that. Eaten fresh, sparingly, or dried and stored for later use. When eaten in large quantities, the berry is reported to impart a red tint to the entire body. But perhaps for ceremonial dancing or shamanistic rites, I mean, that might be kind of interesting. Don't try it. Common snowberry. Roots pounded and steeped as a cold remedy and to soothe an upset stomach. Seed pods gathered, used as soap to wash hair. Distilled and applied externally, has a gentle cleansing and healing effect upon the skin, killing body parasites and helping wounds heal. Mature hardened branches were used to make arrow shafts. How many are familiar with the little common snowberry? Mostly it's winter. We see it in late summer and into fall and winter, and it'll hang around for a long time. The next time you see that plant, just roll the seed pods in your hand. They're fairly substantial. Chaparral currant. Fruit eaten fresh or dried for later use, boiled to make jams and jellies, roots chewed to ease sore throats, inner bark distilled into a poultice for sores and swellings. Think about the cycle of the year. A lot of these plants come up and then they disappear. They're not all in all areas. So if you needed treatment for certain things, these plants becoming available at different times, you would use them for the same thing, just different times of the year. And it's amazing the range of illnesses that the native people suffered from that we don't tend to think that they would have had. Hillside Gooseberry. Berries collected, eaten fresh, or boiled into a jam, jelly, or condensed to form a chewy fruit leather. I've tasted these. They're not bad. The spines on them, for some reason, just as soon as you put them in your mouth, you're not even aware of the spines. I don't know why. I guess they're that fragile. They're not bad. You know, they have a kind of a sharpish taste. Elderberry. When fully ripe, berries eaten fresh or dried. Dried berries sometimes mixed, again, with bits of dried meat, then pounded into a kind of chewy jerky. Straight elderberry branches were made into whistles, flutes, clapper sticks, and cooking utensils. The Ohlone carefully managed this resource to improve the quality and quantity of its strong, straight branches. If you've ever seen an elderberry that anybody has been cutting and hacking, when the branches come back, they're going to go straight up. Just like clapper sticks, just like flute size, whistle size. I do have a handout, Chautauqua Family Days, coming up in July, and there is a very gentle older man. I don't know if he is a Native American descendant or not, but he will teach children and adults how to make flutes. You can make a flute there, a whistle there, or a clapper stick during the afternoon with him. And it's delightful, and that'll be in July. I do have a handout. I'll get that. Oh, elderberry. Elderberry is really, really common. It really, really creates a lot of berries. So to me, it would be understandable that they would preserve some for later use and dry it. This is the holly-leaf cherry. We see these trees, the chaparral plant. We see these trees, but until I visited Ulistack, and Dennis Dowling pointed out all the native, the fruiting plants and trees that he had, I had never seen it. It has a very large seed, and it's not anywhere near as sweet or as tart as the cherries that we buy, but then it's not cultivated. He has another wild cherry there, the Catalina cherry, that they believe the native people traded because the Catalina cherry is larger, it's tastier, and the seed is a little bit smaller. But in our area, we do have some of the Catalina cherry, and the only way they can figure it got here was through trading. Fruit collected, eaten fresh or dried, stored for later use. Wood used in creating traps. Pinkberry Manzanita. Tough, tangled branches were cut, pruned to fashion into traps. Tender shoots of the coastwood fern were gathered as a food source. Pinkberry Manzanita. Originally it was called bearberry because the grizzly bears, loved this resource. And there are accounts of a big hillside, Chaparral Hillside, in the Los Angeles area where the settlers counted 20 grizzly bears feeding on the Manzanita berries. One of the things that it talks about in that Chaparral book on the Chaparral, which is very readable, is just how much the landscape was changed and altered by the big mammals that we used to have in the valley. The grizzly bears, the black bears, the elk, the Thule elk, the pronghorn, primarily the elk, and the bears, how they shaped the landscape and how all that is gone because we got rid of all of them. How many of you have tasted the little Manzanita berries? When they get ripe this year, taste them. You can eat them. You can pop them in your mouth. I've seen county parks people do it. Staff people do it. Pop them in your mouth. This year, I'm going to find a place where I can collect some. To make the steeped tea or the cider, you just put them in some hot boiling water. Let them steep for, half hour or so. Or you can put them in some ice water and let them turn into tea. And that's all there is to it. So the groves attracted wildlife, which in turn were trapped and hunted. Berries eaten fresh or stored for later use. You can pick one of these up on the ground almost 6 months later, and it'll taste okay. It'll still be, it's got lots of vitamin C, and it still has that same taste. Steeped berries made a flavorful cider or tea. Buckeye, seeds crushed, thrown into streams to stupefy fish, making them easier to catch. Wood used to make fire drills. Drilling buckeye wood produces a fine powder that easily ignites using friction. Buckeye seeds were gathered, buried in boggy soil to leach out the bitterness. Could then be boiled, mashed, and eaten like a potato. If you study Native people, they'll get around to talking about what they call a starvation diet. And the starvation diet was always the types of foods they had to rely on when there was nothing else available. And I think part of the reason that they would collect the very bitter buckeye seeds and then put them in some boggy ground and forget about them for a couple months was because in January, February, if they were, for whatever reason, didn't have a lot of food, they would at least be able to go and dig up the buckeyes and eat them. Coffeeberry, the chaparral plant again. Bark distilled, taken as a laxative. Mashed berries mixed with sap and leaves was applied to stop bleeding and to heal infected sores, burns, and wounds. This is another, I would try this remedy because for some reason this is a very, very wholesome plant to me. This is the bay laurel. Known to the Ohlone as the medicine tree, steep leaves used as a decongestant in the treatment of colds, sinus infections. Fresh leaves are a natural insecticide and were stored with foodstuffs, baskets, to deter insects. However, avoid prolonged breathing the air where concentrations of leaves are stored in small enclosed areas due to their natural toxicity, which can be overpowering. That long old sentence was sent to me by a Native American descendant, Ohlone, who, for her tribe, they weren't real keen on the bay laurel. They saw it more as a health hazard than a beneficial plant, which was the first time I heard about that. It's a member of, bay laurel is a member of the avocado family. The fruit, the Ohlone collected the fruit for the seeds, which are stored for later use. Dried seeds are high in fat protein, making the nut an important food resource. Seeds were toasted before eating. I understand they don't really taste all that good, but they taste better when they're toasted. And I'm sure the Ohlone would have pounded them and mixed them with other things. Toyum, or California holly, sometimes called Christmas berry. Native people and early pioneers collected berries, baked them into pies and small, soft loaves of bread. And the Ohlone did this. I have read accounts, I think in the Danza expedition, as well as some of the other early settler and explorer accounts, where they traded with the native people for loaves of this little hard bread made out of native resources. We would never think of eating these berries today, but the early settlers, the early pioneers, would eat them with relish. They would use them, bake them into pies, and things like that. Los Angeles, the hillsides became denuded because so many people were gathering this plant, and so they actually passed a law. This was I think, in about the 1880s. They passed a law saying you can't go out and collect the toyon berries. So it also gave the name Hollywood to the city of Hollywood, because it was also called the Hollywood. Madrone, tea made from roots, barks, leaves as a treatment for colds. Peeling bark used as a fire kindling. This is a really interesting tree. Very useful to the native people. Berries were cooked, dried, and stored, then soaked in warm water before eating. You would never think of eating these berries. Dried hardened berries used to make colorful beads. I can speak Madrone. Have you ever heard the Madrones talking to themselves? They grow very, very tall when they're left to themselves, and they twist. They twist naturally, and then they start to cross, and where they cross and they bump into each other, they make sounds. And if it's the first time you've ever heard it in the forest, it's very eerie. But I recorded it, and then I taught myself to speak Madrone. Tough, tangled branches of the madrone were pruned, shaped to make traps for birds, small animals. Like the manzanita, the madrone, chaparral again, this is really tough wood. You run into a sharp piece of manzanita or madrone, and it'll put a hole in you. And so you can see, now to get this picture, I just stepped inside the leaf cover, you know, the branches, the outer branches, and took the picture. And you can see how tangled it is, and you take those pieces and you can fashion traps. And that's what they do, that's what they used to do. California walnuts. Nuts gathered and eaten fresh or stored for later use. Nuts contain high amounts of oil, which was extracted to use in cooking. Shells of the California walnut were used to make gaming dice. The split shells were cleaned, sanded smooth, filled with asphaltum, ocean tar, then decorated with bits of abalone shell. And I found that if you strike one of those black walnuts, or not black walnuts, California walnut, on just the right place, it pops open like that, and then you strike it again, and it'll pop open again, and you'll have complete seeds. You don't need as many California walnuts to flavor something as you would with European walnuts. They have a much, much stronger taste. And they're native. Now we're into the trees. Willow, branches used in basketry, limbs used in building shelters. Along with tule, willow was an abundant natural resource found throughout Santa Clara Valley. The willow has the property that you can bend the poles, bend the branches, and they don't break. So to make their little tule huts, they made the framework out of willow poles. Around the top, these little domes, they made the outline for their baskets, the top edge, or different pieces if it was going to be curved or something, out of willow, and then their hoop and spear game. The hoop was made out of the willow because you could bend it in a circle. It's pretty amazing stuff, and it was an abundant resource, is an abundant resource. White alder, a decoction of dried bark, stimulated circulation, checked diarrhea, cure a stomachache, facilitate childbirth, and check hemorrhages. Bark peeled from tree limbs in spring used to create a yellow dye for basketry. That's our lovely white alder. Digger or gray pine. The pitch was used as an adhesive. Twigs, needles, and rootlets were used as sewing materials for coil and twined baskets. Distilled resin was used as a cleaning agent, think vigorous rubbing, and as an insecticide. That's our little digger pine. There are 19 oak species in California and 30 distinct varieties. Acorns from oaks were harvested for food by native people throughout the state. An acorn is like a tiny energy bar complete with protein, fat, and carbohydrates. Acorns made up 70% of the Ohloni's diet. It was a dependable, plentiful food source. Acorns from different varieties of oaks were kept separate until combined and blended for cooking. Ripe, dried acorns were first pounded into flour, leached to remove the bitterness, then boiled to make soup, porridge, or until thick enough to form a flat cake or small loaf of bread. The valley oak, largest of all oak species, some growing up to 100 feet tall. The largest California oak on record was a valley oak with a trunk 26 feet in circumference. When Europeans first came into this area, you had botanists from all over the world coming to see the oaks because they were just so huge and so fantastic. Coast live oak. High tannins in bark, acorns, galls were helpful in treating bladder infections, washing open wounds, reducing inflammation, and regulating bowels. Blue oak. Blue oak forests are the most productive in terms of concentrations of wildlife, and I mean from the insects and the vegetation and the fungus and the slime molds up. This would have made them a valuable resource for the Ohlone. Black oak. Acorns reputed to be the best tasting of all oak acorns. Common to Central Valley and the Sierra foothills, less common along the coast and inland valleys. Tanbark oak. Not a true oak, however, its fruit is still called acorn, and the Ohlone gathered it for food. However, the tanbark oak acorn is the least tasty of those acorns gathered by the Ohlone. The bark of the tanbark oak was distilled to create a dye. Big leaf maple. Wood used in making boat paddles, the inner bark was shredded and fashioned into aprons or skirts. The Ohlone didn't go naked all the time. What I tell the children is they wore clothing appropriate to the task. And if they were fishing, there was no need for clothing. And if they were getting sweaty building a tule hut, no, they wouldn't bother to wear clothing. However, the women sitting on tule mats or sitting on bare rock used a leather apron to be more comfortable, and they had kind of a little shredded grass skirt that would actually keep them cool, but somewhat shaded for the long hours of work. Sycamore, bark used as fire tinder, wood used in making boat paddles. Very common in our valley. This is only a brief overview of the hundreds of different plants used by the Ohlone. Plant uses vary from tribe to tribe and geographical area throughout the state. As our individual knowledge of native plant use grows, it is hoped that the information presented here will evolve to include each new discovery. Thank you. That is it.